hosting us, and Representative Meyer, the chance to be inside the Capitol. I was telling you, I passed by the building so many times and never had a chance to actually set foot inside. So we're very grateful to you, to Josh, and to all the participants today for being here and welcoming us and making sure that we have this incredibly important conversation about the future of this community and of the country. We just now were at Moulton Elementary School, where we got to meet one of the most amazing principals I've ever seen. Just is establishing such a beautiful culture within that school. Is welcoming children who are maybe 4th or 5th generation Des Moines, kids who may have been in this country 4 or 5 days, who just live in a refugee camp, who do not speak English. And he and the teachers and support staff so pumped about the first day of school tomorrow. But I also know that in the front or in the back of their minds, and in the minds of a lot of kids who will be starting school tomorrow, is this concern about gun violence and what many see as an inevitable moment when someone will walk into their school with a firearm and take the lives of those students that they're serving or those fellow students with whom they attend school. I know that in El Paso, where our 3 kids just started school, that was a conversation that we had in our house. All of our kids have participated in active shooter drills, getting ready for something again that they feel may be only a matter of time. And we saw in Santa Fe, Texas, after a shooting there in the high school, something from one of those students that really clarified the challenge that we have right now in this country. In the immediate aftermath of that mass murder, that student was asked whether she was surprised that this had happened. And she said, no, I knew it was going to happen sooner or later. And to listen to children who, in very clear-eyed terms, know exactly what they're going to do when the gunman walks in. The bookshelf that they're going to pull over, the stuff that they're going to throw in the air, trying to create time and space for some students to make it out, knowing that others will not, really says everything you need to know about gun violence in America today and our complete lack of progress and political will to confront that. And to lose 40,000 of our fellow Americans to accept, which is what we've functionally done, 6 and 7-year-olds being killed in the classrooms, or high school students hunted in their halls, or something that we're aware of nationally. It has become so numbingly common for children in some communities, for adults in some communities for that matter, to be killed, that their names do not even make the headlines or the nightly news or break into our consciousness. So I'm grateful to each of you, to whom we will give the credit. Joe and I were talking about this earlier. When we finally do pass universal background checks and they're signed into law, when we have red flag laws, when we stop selling weapons of war, and I know not everyone will agree on this point, but for those of us who believe that weapons of war should no longer belong to civilians because they don't have a civilian use, if we make progress on any or all of those issues, it will be because of the advocacy and the urgency with which you have met this challenge, the local leadership, the state leadership, in the face of an absence of leadership at the federal level. That's really what we're counting on today, and I'm hopeful that the conversation that we have can be used to inform the national conversation and to ensure that we make progress while inviting every point of view, even those that don't necessarily agree with some of the conclusions that I've come to. We learned by going to a gun show recently in Arkansas that we'll surprise ourselves by how much common ground there is, and that those gun dealers and gun sellers and the people who just bought an AR-15 also have kids who are starting school and are just as worried about gun violence and want to come up with a solution, and maybe open to some of the solutions that we're going to talk about here today if we'll only invite them into the conversation. And I think at this very divided moment, that might be a great way to approach a really big threat and challenge that we have as a country. So very grateful to you all, and I hope, Josh, if it's okay with you, we can just go around and have everyone introduce themselves, maybe say what brought you here to the table today.
That'd be perfect.
Amber, do you want to start us off?
Sure, absolutely. I'm Amber Gustafson. I'm from Ankeny, Iowa. I'm a mom of 3, gun owner. My son is on the trap shooting team at our high school. I grew up on a farm in southwest Iowa, so I grew up around guns, very familiar with that. I'm also former chapter leader for Moms Demand Action, now currently doing gun owner outreach for the state chapter and on the national training team for Moms Demand Action. I'm passionately committed to this issue on many fronts, but recently have really decided to take more time to pay attention to the issue of gun suicide, particularly among white males, where it is the largest share of gun deaths in this country.
Thank you, and I want to hear more about that after we finish the introductions.
Representative Meyer, and I'm also an attorney in town here, and I represent the southeast side of Des Moines. The reason I'm here, Beto, is I appreciate the comprehensive nature of your plan. And when I read it the other day, talking about red flag laws, talking about banning assault weapons, and there's a whole spectrum here of things that can be done. And I also appreciate you reaching out to the other side, people that may not agree with us 100%. But there's a lot of common ground, like you said, you found in Arkansas. And the reason I'm here is, I saw Councilmember Mandelbaum try to do what he did in Des Moines, which was incredible. Nobody's ever tried it. And a real concern for gun violence in this state, in this town. And I appreciate the fact that you have released a comprehensive plan.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Chris.
My name is Christian Heine, and I'm the Vice President of Policy at Brady. I came to this movement in 2005. My parents had spent a holiday vacation together. It was Memorial Day weekend, and they spent the weekend. They borrowed a boat from my dad's best friend, and they just spent the weekend getting sunburned and eating barbecue and just having an awesome time with our dogs. When they came back from that vacation the next Monday, they came to drop that boat off at my dad's best friend's house. My dad's best friend had a restraining order against an individual as a credible threat of violence. And that man came and did exactly what the judge thought he would. Because my parents were there, he turned the gun on them as well. My dad was shot 3 times. He actually had tried to the man had come up and shot my dad's best friend, Steve, in the stomach. He then turned the gun on my dad. My dad tried to sort of lead him away from my mother, and it worked. Maybe he was leading away from my mother, maybe he was just running for his life. But the gunman followed him and shot him 2 more times. And when he had come back, the gunman, my mom, rather than running away, had stayed to keep Steve alive. And neighbor said that she begged for her life, got about 10 steps, and he shot and killed her in the back with a single bullet. As my dad healed from his wounds. We're still trying to figure out how to heal emotionally all these years later. But when we started peeling back the layers of the onion of how, did this happen? How did this man, who ended up having this history of violence, who had been arrested multiple times even for trying to fight police officers, how did he get access to these 3 weapons that he used? Really, over the course of 16 hours, where he ended up shooting and wounding a police officer. He bludgeoned a mother to death in front of 2 children, put both those kids in the ICU, and ultimately took his life in a Walmart in Southern California. And we found that with all of the holes and loopholes that we systematically have in our legal code, no community can be safe from gun violence. I come from a very safe neighborhood. It's a place that they said my parents were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And then later on, our hometown was the site of another mass shooting. I come from Thousand Oaks, California. And once again, the papers say this doesn't happen here, but it did happen, and it continues to happen. So I've been fighting ever since to try to bring reason and common sense back to our gun laws, and I'm excited for this conversation, just the work that you are doing, that all the legislators in this room are doing, because this conversation, bringing people together, it's the only way that we're going to get the change that we need to keep our community safe. So thank you so much for having us here.
Robert?
Yeah, my name is Robert Disney. I'm also with Brady. I work in the grassroots. What brought me to this issue is that my family was from Columbine. We're from Littleton, Colorado, and my niece was a student at Columbine. My brother-in-law was a member of the SWAT team for the local police department that had to respond to the school, his own kid's school, for the shooting. It's an issue that still rocks that community. I was back there. I brought a bunch of Parkland students to Littleton for the 19th or 20th anniversary of Columbine, and it was only at that point when I realized just how deeply affected my own community still was from this gun violence that happened an entire generation ago. And how infuriating it is that we have gone an entire generation and haven't done anything about it. My brother-in-law, who was on the SWAT team, has since gone on to be the chief of police at a community college, and that is one of his primary concerns is this kind of shooting. He's a Trump voter. He and I do not agree on almost anything in politics, but this issue, he is here. He is ready to act, and I think the majority of Americans are. It's just this vocal minority that is stopping the will of the people. And so I'm really proud of you. I'm really proud of all of these legislators who are finally standing up and saying, no, this is enough. We've got to do something about it. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. Joe?
Yeah, my name is Joe Gordon. I'm a criminology professor at the University of Northern Iowa, where I teach courses on gun violence and homicide. So on one hand, there's this type of social scientific interest and concern about a deeply social problem that can yield to social remedies. But I don't think that's really why I come to this. I think, for me, I grew up in a time sort of in the 60s when there was a lot of hope politically, even as a child in elementary school. And John Kennedy was shot to death, and Robert Kennedy was shot to death, and Medgar Evers was shot to death, and Martin Luther King Jr. was shot to death. And for a lot of people at that time, this had a searing effect on us. And then, of course, I've, like many of us, I've lost people who were personally loved by me who died from gun violence. So there is that. There is that sort of what I say to my students is sort of the non-rational element of public policy, the emotional part of it. So I come to it both as a scientist who really understands that there are rational reasoned solutions to this problem, and we know that because we've seen it in so many other countries, right? I think I would just say, maybe talk about this a little bit more later. I also very interested nowadays in making sure that in our focus on rampage killings and mass homicides, that we don't lose sight of the day-to-day homicides that are taking place. And a statistic that I often try to cite to people, I had a couple of my students collect this information from the Gun Violence Archive, and this just blows my mind. I mean, it just really, I can't, now part of it is because we've not just collected the data, we've looked at the photographs of some of the victims. But in fiscal year 2018, 220 infants, toddlers, and preteens were shot to death. Shot to death. Many of them in the presence of their siblings or parents, many of them with their parents present, many of them by their parents, many unintentional, okay? And this to me is just a horrifying, unconscionable part of American life that, and if you think about that, that's 10 Sandy Hooks a year. That's what that is, that's 10 Sandy Hooks a year. So while rampage killings and mass homicides really need our attention and will yield to certain kind of solutions, I don't think we want to let that divert too much our attention from the homicides that take place. We had 2 police officers assassinated right here in Des Moines by someone who had a record of being a bona fide troublemaker and was able to acquire an AR-15 and assassinate these 2 police officers. So I think we need to understand that this problem, like an epidemic, it takes a variety of forms. And but the good news is, as you said earlier today, Beto, is this will yield to social interventions and to a push to do better. And we appreciate what you're doing in that respect. And I want to say also to Councilman Mandelbaum, we haven't met, but I want to thank you for what you have been trying to do at City Council, because the important part of that, and people who sort of follow this issue a little bit know, that the symbolism of that is really important, because one of the things that's hurting us so much in Iowa are these preemption laws that prevent local jurisdictions from passing their own gun laws. And so if in Blackhawk County, where I live, we decide, hey, you know, we'd like to be safe from people having street sweepers out there. We want to pass a law against that. We cannot do it because the state legislature, controlled by conservatives, are preempting us from doing that. So thank you, sir, for helping to elevate, you know, that is an important issue. Appreciate that.
Sure. Dr. Holmes?
I'm Lydia Home, and I'm a pediatric emergency medicine doctor here in Des Moines at Williams Children's Hospital. I did my training in Kansas City. And so, you know, when you were talking about seeing the pictures of the, you know, kids that have been shot, you really can't imagine what it's like to see them, you know, and I'll always remember one little girl, she was in the backseat of a car with her mom, and there was a shooting, and she was shot in the head, came in my ER, and, you know, we moved to action, intubate, stabilize, we got her down to the OR for the neurosurgeon, and she lived, but that little girl, I think on her life, what is her life like now? I think that the shooting deaths are the tip of the iceberg.
That's right.
There are so many people that are dealing with the consequences of gun injury. And I also wanted to go back to what Amber said about suicides, because really 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. And, you know, for me in the ER, it makes me sad. I don't see those teenagers, because it's such a lethal way to commit suicide, and they choose guns and then it's all over. But I see lots of teenagers who come in, who've taken some pills, or they've tried another method, and they change their minds almost all the time. But when you use a gun, then there's no opportunity to change your mind. There's no opportunity for treatment. So I like to come at this from a public health perspective. This is a public health emergency, and these deaths are preventable. And so in ER, I'm all about any injury prevention that can save kids, so that it's not too late by the time that they come to me. And I think there's a lot of things we can do, starting with full repeal of the Dickey Amendment and increased funding for research with CDC and the NIH. But
Just trying to get numbers as we put together our gun violence policy proposal was incredibly difficult.
it is.
And as you alluded, literally the Centers for Disease Control was by law prevented from gathering the data. And I liken it to if 50 years ago, we prevented the CDC or the Surgeon General from investigating cigarette smoking and whether it was connected to lung cancer, because we just didn't want to know the answer. And we're afraid of the consequence and the actions we would have to take afterwards. And it's kind of what we've done around gun violence in this country.
And we know that public health programs work.
Yes.
Because you look at car deaths, and there are
Right.
millions more cars on the road, but there are tons less deaths. And so we can do it.
Right, tobacco use as well, and lung cancer deaths. And
Yes.
the consequences from that, and the benefit from treating it as a public health issue and emergency and responding accordingly. So thanks for raising that. I really appreciate it. And I may want to, as we continue the conversation, you talked about public health. And I know that for many, the response has been that we need to reduce access to video games and we need to do a better job of treating mental health. But I almost feel like that is then giving up and just saying this is just something that people who are not well do, and we can't really control that, or maybe we can just prevent them from having video games. But we know from studying other countries, you mentioned this, that higher use of video games also have mental health care challenges, and really also what a disservice to people who are struggling with mental health challenges to somehow say they're inherently violent or dangerous, which they are not.
They're more likely to be the victim of it.
That's right, absolutely.
To be the perpetrator.
And you have the basis to tell us that, right? This is your profession and what you know and what you see every day. So really appreciate that perspective. Thank you. Jim?
Hi, a little background, I'm a retired police officer from the Moline Metro here. And I'm also a veteran, so I'm very familiar with the AR platform intimately, probably more than I would like over the years. I can speak to gun violence and death for hours. I can tell you a number of people that I've engaged with over the years. So, and I still have skin in the game. I've got 4 kids that are in public service, 2 in the military, one's a police officer here. One of my twins, she works for the Youth Law Center in Des Moines. The amount of violence that pops up in these kids' life, I mean, we got gang flashers in the 1st grade, and they're already signaling out what they're gonna do in different schools in Des Moines. So gun violence is a aspect of violent culture. So it's an overview. Gun violence is the one that gets all the attention, you know, but like you said, you can't legislate hate, which is common that everybody can agree with. So things that we can legislate are the symptoms and the eventual problems that come out of that. So to my mind, this is nothing but a public health concern. It needs to be addressed that way, and it needs to be addressed in 360 degrees of solutions. Because one solution isn't going to work. It just won't. So I appreciate having law enforcement at the table. I can assure you that if you have law enforcement involved in the conversation and solutions, you will go a long way having their input. One of the problems is when we come up with solutions, okay, now how do you enforce that? How do I do a red flag law? I'm a 3-year guy out in the night patrol. I got to make a decision about going to somebody's house, taking it from them, deciding what they are, who they are, what they did. I don't have a county attorney. I don't have anybody. I got to do this. So training becomes extremely important. And training in Iowa is not supported heavily by our legislature. It's actually less support than it was 30 years ago. So more and more of that burden fall on local agencies. The local taxpayers pick up much more of that expense, that they become resistant to spending so much money on public safety. So it becomes a circle for your coppers that are out there working late night. So what am I supposed to do? You know, so getting this conversation going, finding that direction is excellent. I appreciate your effort to bring this around.
Thank you, and thanks also for offering this perspective. Whatever the solutions are, I think we all agree, as you said, there will be no one solution to this. We also have to think about implementing it and who we're asking to implement it. And it will be law enforcement who right now are asked to confront people who may be, in some instances, better armed than the police officer or the sheriff's deputy. Often, and you mentioned in implementing red flag laws, may be the ones who have the responsibility of going to that home and disarming somebody who may be a danger to themselves. We mentioned suicide being a leading cause, and the preponderance of the gun deaths that we see, or maybe a danger to somebody else. And we're counting on that law enforcement officer to do that job. So listening to you and others on the front end in terms of how we design this is critical towards its successful enforcement. So I appreciate your being willing to be part of that as well. And also your public service, and it sounds like the public service of your children. Great perspective for us to have. One of the things that really struck me in the aftermath of the El Paso shooting, one, the heroism of the first responders and law enforcement. It was an active shooter situation for a very long time, and they did a terrific job. They also were the primary consolers of family members who did not know what had happened to a loved one. Tragic story after tragic story. Son and father dropping off their mom, his wife, just to run in and grab some groceries. They waited with the car running in the Walmart parking lot, and she never came out. And it was a police officer who was going to have to share that with them. The trauma surgeons, the nurses, but also we learned the custodial staff, who, as one patient was wheeled out of the trauma bay, they came in like a NASCAR pit crew, cleaned it all down in no time flat to make sure that they could save the next life. That to me was really extraordinary. But some of these surgeons are also in the Guard, also work at William Montgomery Medical Center, and one of them is about to deploy in the next month. And he shared with me that many of the wounds he was seeing are wounds like he saw in Afghanistan and Iraq. He said, very different from a handgun wound, the level of devastation, and you can probably speak to this, all the kinetic energy is spent inside the body, or much of it is, or most of it is, and just all the soft tissue damage, the perforations, lungs, livers. It was really probably thanks to their battlefield experience that they were able to save so many of these lives. So can't thank law enforcement and first responders in the medical community in El Paso and in all of our communities enough for what they're doing. So thanks for being here. Josh, how do you want to proceed? Should we just open the conversation?
We can open it. I had some questions, although
Great.
folks have talked about various pieces of it, but I can use that as prompts. You know, one that I had, Amber, it was for you, and it, the conversation around mental health, it comes up in ways that sometimes are not helpful, almost as an excuse and paralysis. But in the context of gun violence, there's an area where it is absolutely critical to understanding, and that's what you were talking about, is gun suicides. And there are over 22,000 gun suicides annually in this country. As you mentioned, it accounts for roughly 2/3 of the gun deaths. And tackling that, if we're serious about reducing gun violence in a meaningful way, there's no way to avoid that issue. So what, as you're starting to focus on that, what do you see as the path forward?
Well, I'll tell you what the path forward is not, and it's not locking people up. And I think we have heard from an individual at a very high seat of power in this country that has spoken twice now about locking up people with mental illness. It's a violation of the Fourth Amendment, and it's not a solution to the problem of gun violence in this country, because you could lock up every single person with a mental health diagnosis and have no appreciable effect on the number of gun deaths. When it comes to the issue of suicide, the mental health is less a predictor of someone who will attempt suicide or actually take their lives than gun ownership. So it's a greater predictor. So easy access to weapons, because we do know that it's about 10 minutes from initial ideation to completion of suicide, whatever method the person chooses. So breaking that cycle or that path towards suicide is really important. Things like waiting periods and that sort of thing can really be helpful. I also think that there's a really important part of the conversation for peer-to-peer interaction when it comes to that issue, because ultimately gun owners we know best how to talk to other gun owners about safety. I think it's about empowering fellow gun owners to open up that conversation and to remove the stigma. If you see a friend that's struggling, maybe they're having marital issues, maybe they're having issues at work, maybe they're having health problems, talking with them, talking with their family members, talking with law enforcement, and intervening. There's something about people that choose to own guns. Oftentimes it's because of a very noble desire to protect. And so protecting your friends from taking their own lives is also a really crucial part of that conversation, and it's a very beautiful part of being a protector, is protecting your friends from harming themselves. And so I think there's a place for that. We talked about the issue of public health. I mean, things like designated drivers and the Buckle Up program, encouraging parents to put their kids in car seats, or the Back to Sleep program, encouraging parents to put their kids to sleep on their backs. These aren't legislative issues. They're health providers, doctors, and that sort of thing, having conversations with folks and encouraging them to make right choices. I think we need to explore that more fully and put more money and resources into something like that.
From some of what you just shared and what Dr. Holm shared earlier about young people and access to firearms, and something I did not know until you just shared it, that the distance between suicidal ideation and acting on that is 10 minutes, or can be 10 minutes. When we were at that gun show in Conway, Arkansas, and the first person came up to me and when I asked him what we should be doing, he said, I shouldn't be allowed to sell at this gun show. I'm not a federally licensed dealer. I don't have to perform the background check. If you're 18 years old and you have a pulse, I sell you a gun. And he said, this wasn't me, he said, I should be able to do this. Begs the question, why is he doing this? But I think he was trying to make the larger case that he should not be allowed to do this by law. We proposed raising the age to 21 because of what you just described, because of what you have seen. Now, I can understand, you know, Jim, you mentioned your children serving in the military. I can understand someone serving in the military, someone who's hunting with their mom or their father, who is 18 years old, who is 16 years old, who wants to be able to do that. We ensure that is provided for in our proposal, that hunting, learning the responsibility of gun ownership at a young age, all of that you would be able to continue to do. But being 18 years old, going to a gun show, buying a gun, and then perhaps using it against yourself, that would be much harder to do. Tell me if you think that makes sense, or if not, another way that we address especially young people and suicidal ideation, their ability to act on it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's funny because the auto industry has kind of figured this out. You can't rent a car until you're 25, you know? So we do know that kids, especially kids without adult supervision, you know, their brains aren't fully developed. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. I have a 15-year-old son. He does things all the time, but I'm like, why are you doing that? And I love him dearly. I was also a kid once. You know, I've been a youth group leader for church and you know, was a college academic advisor. And so, you know, the more fail-safes that we can put in place to help break that pathway, that chain of violence, the better. And so, yeah, I mean, I think raising the minimum wage, that would also be good too, but raising the minimum age to purchase guns is a really great idea, and I think there's some good data to support that would be effective in preventing that.
What do you think about gun storage laws?
Oh, yeah.
Locker requirement, you have guns in the home, you also have children in the home. You mentioned 220 toddlers, infants, and preteen, preventable deaths in probably every single instance. What about requiring that? Right now we know in Iowa and Texas, very responsible gun owners, many of whom, you know, understand that responsibility, take it seriously, and keep those guns locked up so kids and their kids' friends can't get to them. What do you think about requiring that, going beyond voluntary participation in that level of responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, furthermore, you know, a lot of states have laws on the books regarding safe storage, and really it ultimately comes up to a county attorney's discretion whether a person will be charged in those instances. And so, you know, definitely enforcing the laws that are on the books. I know in Iowa the law is pretty vague. It says, you know, reasonable, you know, where you could reasonably expect that a child would not have access to a weapon. And so, you know, there can definitely be more clarification put into that. But I think really empowering and encouraging county attorneys to act in situations like that and to take that seriously. And also, really, really importantly, there needs to be racial parity when it comes to that, because oftentimes charges are pressed against people of color in these instances and not against white parents, to be frank. And so there needs to be some real exploration of the equity of the way that those charges are pressed.
Great point. Thank you.
And that goes back to training. A lot of training is not being done in the early stages, police academies, and then having that as a base to infuse it into the field training program. You know, it takes about 8 to 10 months to take a freshly hired kid and turn him into a work cop. You know, so there's, and I understand when we push back from cities and counties in Iowa that it's too expensive, we can't do it. Well, the payouts that you're doing,
Right.
more than pays,
Right.
what you're.
The settlements, yep, absolutely.
Say the same thing about mental health, you know. There's plenty of mental health beds in Iowa, they're just all in jails.
Yep.
So the taxpayers still paying that bill, they're just paying it half instead of, and it goes back to, early childhood, training, or, providing for the state to provide the services. Give me a kid that's gonna have a potential problem, some of the the state can help him with his pool. We're gonna touch somehow.
Right.
So, you know, so many of these things on my end of it, when I watch what's going on with our agencies and our cities and counties, our funding is always big. It's probably the largest single time.
On the training question, you know, one of the things that crystallized for me as a city council member, we're dealing with a situation where actually a motorcycle gang had rented some space in the church. They weren't supposed to rent it, so we were taking enforcement measures to get them out of the church. And that ended up involving our police. The neighbors had complained they were essentially terrorizing and intimidating the neighbors. And the situation crystallized with several of these folks being arrested. And one of the things that I think was emboldening to making what was a tense and dangerous situation more dangerous, one of the individuals was arrested with a handgun and a 30-round magazine. What kind of training, how do you prepare law enforcement for dealing with those type of situations?
First off, yeah, and this is another problem in Iowa. We have a lot of part-time county attorneys. So they have a sizable learning curve when it comes to things. Polk County is lucky. We have a lot of resources. Nobody else probably in the state more than Polk County does collectively. But I still run into those problems. And the bad guys, they got some really smart bad guys out there. You know, they're creative. And so a lot of times we're playing catch up. You know, we're smart too. To say that they're not, that's what you have to say. So they get creative, they find loopholes, they do what they do. Sometimes they're successful. Sometimes it takes government, whether it's city council or the county board, for them to figure out a way to undo what they're doing. If we can't do that, that's how you have different kinds of meth. You know, some scientists decide to change one element, and now that element isn't described in the law. Now we got a new drug. It takes 3 years for legislation to make that illegal. So government needs to be a little bit more responsive in some of these things. We need to hold people like you accountable. All of us collectively, every single elected person needs to be held accountable. You know, to what's going on. And sometimes that's a painful experience. And now we're going to ask you to take a stand, and you might think something wrong. But it's good governance. You know, sometimes good governance has some pain in it. You know, as we see in the state right now.
Absolutely.
Can I circle back for just a second, Congressman, on the suicide issue? So, I've been part of a multi-year suicidality reduction initiative. We just received a 3-year federal grant last year to try to reduce suicidality in our campus, because it's particularly at, some people said economics, epidemic stages among university and college students. So one of the things I'd say, I've never, with all my analysis and study of suicide, I've never heard the 10-minute thing, because maybe I haven't bumped into that yet. But the problem with mental health interventions with suicidality is, first of all, it does exist in this continuum, and many times people who commit suicide are on that continuum silently. For instance, I lost a student in 2011, and when he took his life with a handgun, everyone was shocked, and this is not uncommon. So it's very difficult to intervene for someone who is suffering silently. This is also sometimes with rampage killings, because that killer is also intended to commit suicide. And sometimes they're to be killed, suicide by cop, or they kill to take their own lives, and sometimes they don't for a variety of reasons. But it's the same thing, because people are shocked, like the parents of the El Paso killer.
Right.
They didn't see it coming. So
Although interestingly, the mother called the police
Yeah.
when his AK-47 came in.
Right.
She just go, what does this guy need? with
Right, but that was a
AK-47?
surprise to her.
Yeah.
And she was worried, and she was shocked.
Right.
So, one of the things I'd say is this: the reason why the age restriction is so important is because my student took his life, I think he was 19 or 20. A beautiful young man, just a great guy. I mean, it's just a terrible loss. And so I think that an effort to reduce access to people until they reach a more level of maturity where they can cope with the emotional stresses of life would probably save a lot of lives. We wouldn't stop all suicides by gun, but we would save a lot, because, Councilman, we just don't know enough about who's suffering to be able to intervene. So when you can't intervene, then what we have to do is create some kind of constraints to access.
Well, I think, and also having the conversation based in evidence, right? Not just playing guesswork. How do we tie policies to where the evidence is, right? There are, things that we can do to restrict access to lethal means when individuals are in crisis. Part of that discussion is safe storage laws. And you can do that with the carrot or the stick, right? We can create penalties that create deterrence, the way we have for individuals, parents who turn off their cars and leave their children in the car while they go inside, and those deaths are tragic for the parents responsible for it. But we have made that deterrent because we've drawn a line in the sand, right? We need to do the same for parents who responsibly leave their guns out for access. Also, maybe we incentivize gun owners to buy safes through tax incentives. Maybe we look at projects like the gun shop project that's happening in Colorado, where we work with gun dealers to talk about the risk associated with access to firearms. And also, when we do, there are moments of crisis here, right? El Paso's an example. This mother who literally tried to do the right thing and was prevented from doing so because she didn't have the mechanism in place.
Or she didn't know what the right thing was.
Right.
She calls, I don't even know what to
I mean,
ask you. I just don't understand why he's ordering this. She wasn't even asking him to stop him. It just is so bizarre to her that he would want an AK-47.
Well, and look at the shooting that really made extreme risk orders, right? Such a part of the national conversation was the shooting in Isla Vista in Santa Barbara. You had parents who literally said, "I'm worried my son is going to do something
Right.
terrible. Can you go check in on him?"
Right.
And law enforcement, you didn't meet the threshold of an involuntary commitment.
Yeah.
Because once again, this isn't something where we're perpetuating false claims about mental illness, but what we need is to give law enforcement the pure legal authority when somebody is in crisis to simply remove the firearm. We're not trying to create an avenues of criminality. And what's so exciting about the extreme risk laws is that they are proven to save lives, especially to prevent suicides. The study in Connecticut came out of Duke University showed individuals subject to these risk warrant laws in Connecticut are 40 times more likely to die by suicide. So you're getting at an at-risk population. On average, they were removing 7 guns, on average, from everybody who was subject to these risk warrants. Something that's really key is that 1 in 3 individuals subject to these risk warrants were given access to care. That could be mental health care, that could be drug or alcohol abuse counseling, it could be anger management, it could be a slate of things, but they were getting access to care rather than perpetuating stigmas. These create gateways to care. And lastly, for every 10 to 20 orders that were issued, at least 1 suicide was prevented. So these are an effective tool of suicide. And the most recent study that just came out this week from the Gun Violence Prevention Research Center out of UC Davis showed that it's very potent in preventing these mass shootings too, right? That even in California, in the small sample study that they were looking, they examined and saw that somewhere over 18 mass shootings, they think that they thwarted partly because it's working in conjunction with the 10-day waiting period in California. But because what we are doing with this tool, why it's so potent, is because we're listening to the evidence. We're not trying to make this about a mental health diagnosis. We've said this a lot, right? But let's be clear. Violent acts that occur in this country, as we know, only 4% are solely attributable to a mental health diagnosis. What these orders do, these extreme risk orders, is that they look at behavioral risk factors. There's no better predictor of future acts of violence than past acts of violence. Drug and alcohol misuse, domestic violence. These are the sort of behavioral indicators that prevent, the violence that we see, either self-harm or interpersonal violence. And so if we try not to work in a silo, right, and we look at the available research and epidemiology we have around us, because even though the government's been sleeping on the job for research, there's amazing research being done by private institutions. And if we inform our policies around that, we know that we can have a tangible effect and save lives. And so, that's why this discussion and these discussions are so exciting. Is we're not starting from scratch. We just need people with the political willpower and the political courage to get them done. And if we do it, lives are saved.
Can I ask you, and others who've been working on this for longer than I have, what gives you any confidence or faith or hope that we're going to achieve any of this? And one can be forgiven for being tempted to give up. That after Sandy Hook, 6 and 7-year-old children in the classroom, after Marjorie Stoneman, after Santa Fe High School, after El Paso. We can name so many, and then and many of you have said this, and it's so important, we should also then elevate those who never make the headlines. The shootings aren't sensational. They've taken their own lives. They're a toddler who was accidentally killed by a brother or a sister. But in the face of all that, the level of inaction and indifference, and we can't just blame one political party for this. Democrats have had control of every level of power within recent history and did not avail themselves of it to address these issues. I often, when I'm looking for hope on an otherwise intractable problem, I think about the civil rights struggle of the 1950s and the 1960s, and how ever since the end of Reconstruction, one could be forgiven for giving up hope that there would ever be anything approaching civil rights in this country. And how did we get President Johnson to use his limited political capital at the beginning of his administration? How did we get members of Congress from the South to vote for that? It really was because I would like to think people who are around this table right now, who were advocating and marching and pushing, and somehow broke into the national consciousness and kind of shocked the conscience of the country. Freedom Riders, crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge with John Lewis, Rosa Parks. They're just these amazing, defiant acts of courage that captured the imagination of the country and really forced, I'm a Texan, so love to give LBJ a ton of credit, but really forced him to act. He had to. I would like to think he was personally moved, but I think he was also politically moved because the political pressure and political will had become so strong to act. You all have been involved in this longer than I have. Are you seeing that in this country right now? Yesterday, March for Our Lives. Yes, released the most ambitious proposal I've seen. Is it the kids, much like the young people before?
I think it's the kids, and they're pushing the rest of us to act. We don't understand why it hasn't happened, because it's ridiculous that nothing has happened.
Right.
And I think, maybe people get on them for not having voted before, but I don't think it's gonna continue like that. I think that they're gonna push the conversation, and they're not gonna just sit by and get jaded like maybe some of the rest of us.
So you're optimistic based on what you're seeing from them.
Mhm.
That's good to hear. I feel the same way, but I don't want that optimism to be misplaced.
What's the tenacity of, everyday Americans? Like, there are communities that are, drastically different from coast to coast. The one commonality that we all have, besides being American and believing in our country, is being affected by gun violence. If you're in North Dakota, you're talking about unintentional shootings and suicides. If you're in Baltimore, you're talking about a different kind of gun violence. If you're at Columbine, you're worried about going to school. Every American is concerned about gun violence, and you're seeing that in the polls. You're seeing that this is a voting issue, and on top of that, you've got grassroots that are single issue voters that are tenacious on this. Moms, Brady, March for Our Lives,
Yeah.
Women's March, all these different groups. And a proof point, Vern Buchanan was one of our top political targets in the 2018 races. We decided that we were going to go after all of these deeply entrenched folks who have constantly refused to do anything on guns, and they've won year after year after year. And we named them, we named the top 9. We won every single one of those races except Vern. Vern Buchanan in Sarasota. And you know what our chapter in Sarasota did? They went up to him and said, "Listen, Vern, we won every single one of our races except for you, but guess what? We're coming back in 2020, so you want to sit down and finally talk to us?"
Yeah.
And you know what? He did.
Yeah.
He sat down and talked to us, and you know what? He voted for H.R. 8, which is expanding universal background checks. The man had never done anything, but it's because of the grassroots. It's because of the American public are sick of seeing this happen. That
That's
all
a
of a
great
sudden,
story.
yeah, all of a sudden people are like, oh dang, I gotta do something.
Yeah.
And I think people are running for office.
Yeah.
Lucy McBath lost her son in that horrible shooting, and now she's in Congress, making a real difference.
And it's survivors too. It's survivors getting up and telling their stories. I mean, you talked about the civil rights movement. I mean, things really began to change when you know, the photos of Emmett Till were shared. And so, you know, in the modern landscape, we have survivors like, you know, you two gentlemen who get up and tell these absolutely heart-wrenching stories. You know, when I was in Washington DC for the Moms National Training Conference, and Brenda Moss, who lost her son in Baltimore to gun violence, got up and spoke. You know, they had asked her to come out and be comforting to us, but she couldn't, and she rained fire. I mean, you can go out and watch her video and just, you know, talk about how we just can't give up. We are climbing the ladder, and we are so close to the top. And so, to me, that's what inspires me, is hearing the stories of survivors and that having the courage to tell about these horrible things that have happened in their families, and how we can draw strength from that.
Very inspiring, right? There's a woman that we met in the Senate campaign, Diana Earl, who lost her son and almost immediately joined Moms and became one of the fiercest advocates I've ever met. And you said this earlier, Jim, holding people like me accountable. What are you going to do if you get into this thing? What are you going to do if you become president to prevent this from happening to another mother, to another family? And then we saw her literally, Cynthia, we saw her, you know, a dozen times, we saw her 100 times across Texas, not just where she lived, traveling everywhere to carry that message. And it worked, and we, like Iowa, very proud gun-owning state, but we were talking about not just universal background checks, but ending the sales of weapons of war. And there are a lot of proud AR-15, AK-47 owners in Texas who use them responsibly and are safe and who I respect, but that was supposed to be a third rail in Texas politics. You could not touch it. But we did, and even in the most conservative, maybe especially in the most conservative places, being in Brownwood and a woman raising her hand, identifying herself as an independent, and my mom, who's a lifelong Republican, said, "Yeah, that means she's a Republican." It's sort of a polite way of saying that at the town hall. And she said, "Look, I was born on a ranch just outside of Brownwood, born with a .22 in my hands, and I was, you know, kind of bracing myself for probably her disappointment in my position." But she then said, "But I have, you know, nearly 24 grandchildren, and all I want to know is whether you're going to represent them or the NRA, protect their lives or protect the political interests." I love that, and that informed our decision to go to the gun show. You just can't break people up. You cannot assume based on party affiliation, geography, whether they own a gun or not, the kind of gun they own, that they're not interested in this conversation. They are, and they have to be at the table. And Jim made this point really well. Law enforcement has to be at the table if we're going to pass and then successfully implement some of the measures that we talked about here.
Yeah, and I just want to say too, you know, this is, it's not new, right? Like, there has been sustained, like, survivors have been trying to tell, you know, our stories for years, right? Like, I've been, you know, from 2005 to 2012, this work felt like I was screaming in an empty hall. And I was meeting mothers and children and community members who had both been directly impacted or shot or hurt, or had lost or had loved ones murdered or taken from them or died by suicide. This issue there's no better time to work on this issue right now because it has been a long time coming, and because Sandy Hook changed the way that Americans decided they were going to approach gun violence. It's no longer the 9th or 10th issue that people care about. People never were, like, you know, unsympathetic to gun violence. They just didn't know that there were solutions. For that 7-year period, and I came to the game late compared to a lot of my predecessors, right? They didn't know that you could buy a gun without a background check. That was not common knowledge. And what's staring at the faces of those 20 children, the 6 educators who laid their life on the line to protect, you know, all the other children there. The best way I've ever heard it said is Andy Goddard, whose son was shot 4 times at Virginia Tech and survived. Back when this happened, he said, you know, it's like every one of these shootings, Columbine, the Oak Creek, Wisconsin shooting, Aurora, all of these shootings that we've sort of been living with and apathetic to have been like drops in the bucket. And that shooting in Sandy Hook tipped the bucket over. And that passion gap is closed. So the reason why the kids in Parkland were successful is because the country at that moment said enough is enough, and it's been building, and we're being. So I just want to, like, as when we talk about our message of hope, I want to be very clear that we have been getting wins. The Moms Demand Action is across the country, right? The Brady chapters and people who are speaking out in state houses across the country are making a direct impact in changing laws in the states. We are making it so that it's politically popular. Let's be really clear about that, right? Like, a lot of people have been really brave and have come out. A lot of people also just see the writing on the wall, the right side of history, and the fact that this is getting people out to the polls. It was the #2 issue in Virginia in the statewide election that changed that legislature in a dramatic way. It is what is changing that state from red to blue because people are sick and tired of the gun violence. So this is the best time to be working on this issue because Americans are ready.
Can I just ask something real quick? I know Cynthia is ready.
Well, why don't we wrap up? I mean, I think that's a good note to wrap up. It's a note of optimism, and it reflects what everyone here around the table, the work that folks have been doing, not just in the last few weeks, but in years. And it is gonna take everyone working together. It's gonna take local elected officials.
Let me just say, the people who are not at the table on the gun violence movement, I've talked about this before, are poor people and people of color. And so the race thing on this, white nationalism is an issue, but the people who are most frequently harmed by gun violence are people of color and low-income families. And so I'm kind of cynical sometimes. I know what we need to do is broaden this movement. If you can help us.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And we need to look at every solution out there. And part of what was positive about this discussion is we talked about suicide prevention. We talked about marshaling what we know and treating this like the public health epidemic that it is, and using evidence-based models and research to inform policy. And part of that is gun violence intervention programs that target where violence is happening at the community level. There are a broad range of solutions, and the momentum is gathering because of folks at the table doing the work and being conscious about broadening the coalition and building the coalition. And we've been doing that, and that's part of what gives me hope that we can do this, that we can make a difference in solving this problem. And people are standing up, and your voice has been really important in helping elevate that issue as well. So I want to give you a chance to close this off, but encourage you to keep elevating this issue, because that is part of what is having an impact, and that's part of what is closing the gap on this.
Thanks, Josh. Thank you for saying that. Thank you again. We said this at the outset, but in the absence of federal or national leadership, you're providing it here. And it's an example not only to other communities, but really, I think, to the country. And for convening everyone together at this table, there were some folks, to your point, who were invited, who were unable to come. We will make sure that they're at this next one, but really elevate everyone's story, everyone's experience when it comes to gun violence, because that's what it's gonna take to achieve any real change. Is everyone's gotta be at the table, and it's gotta defy party division, lines of race, geography. This is something that afflicts all of us in this country. And one of the lessons learned from El Paso, we are one of the safest cities in the United States of America, but nothing can exempt you or separate you from a very violent country. That'll find you sooner or later, and it found us on August 3rd in a city that loses 18 people a year. We lost 22 in under an hour, and so all of us are vested in the solution, and I see all of us working on this. So I asked this question earlier, and you all answered it in the affirmative. I too am very optimistic. I'm very hopeful, and I think it is based on the leadership that I see here, the leadership of others who are making this a defining, decisive issue in our politics, in our democracy, and in our lives. So just want to thank you all for being part of this conversation, for the work that you're doing, and yes, Josh, we will continue to make this a priority, and I look forward to working with you on this. So thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it. Gracias.